cocktail hour. Let's start with some headlines that make you want to drink. First of all, gotta get my slides. Whoops. First of all, the planet is burning, the oceans are filling up with trash, and we're putting a lot of pressure on our fellow creatures on the planet. The source of all these problems is really clear. It is us. We are the cause. And in particular, this mania that we people seem to have for more economic growth, more consumption, more prosperity, growth, growth, growth. You don't have to look very hard at all to find a number of different people saying, we have to stop this. We have to turn our back. We have to do something fundamentally different because this appetite is ruining our planet. And this brings up kind of an important question. Do we have the ability as human beings to solve these huge planetary problems that we have created? And it turns out this question is about half a century old. 50 years ago this year, we had the first Earth Day, when people took to the streets all around the world, demanded change, demanded action with respect to exactly these problems. And about half a century ago, we saw the first wave of concern about exactly these issues, and some pretty fundamental books were written. Do you think that last exclamation point is necessary? I think Famine 1975 gets the point across on its own. But we heard exactly these same kinds of things. And there was a very similar litany coming out 50 years ago around the first Earth Day about the problems that we were facing. And you could think about these problems in three huge categories. The first one was we were just going to deplete the Earth. We were going to run out of the Earth's abundance, the Earth's bounty. And if you looked at the evidence in 1970, you would find a lot of support for this kind of gloomy prediction. Here is 170 years of the size of the US economy. There's a lot of growth going on there. Maybe that's great. Here's 170 years of the energy required to generate that economy. There's a one-for-one relationship here. So you could imagine that green line continuing, and at some point, we're going to run out of the fossil fuels we need to grow the economy. If you just look at the 20th century, the data get better in the 20th century. Here's 70 years of American economic growth. Here is our consumption of some pretty fundamental metals. Here is our consumption of fertilizer for agriculture over the course of those 70 years. Again, we might like the green line. Those gray lines look pretty frightening. And if you keep drawing exponential curves, the numbers get really big and kind of frightening. You could think we're just going to run out of planet. The second big problem was that as we were generating all this economic growth and using all these resources, we were polluting the world, and we absolutely were. This is what was happening to atmospheric pollution levels throughout the country in America. Very similar pattern in every industrialized country. Some of us in this room are old enough to remember that on the drive into work back around Earth Day, there would be reports on the radio about how bad the air was in Munich, in London, in New York. And it was getting worse as we were heading into Earth Day. This is the river in Cleveland, Ohio. It caught on fire in 1969, in the year before Earth Day. And actually, this is a picture of the fire in 1954 in Cleveland. Evidently, by 1969, when the river caught on fire, it was not a big enough deal to send somebody to take a picture of it. That's how bad things were getting. And then the third, and in some sense the most tragic of all, was we were wiping out some of the animals that we share our planet with. This is the North American passenger pigeon. It was an incredibly abundant bird. In 1815, James Audubon, the naturalist, was going across America, and he saw a flock of these birds that took 3 days to pass overhead. And he said sometimes it was dense enough, the flock, to blot out the sun. The last one of these birds died in a cage in Cincinnati in 1914. We eliminated it from the planet. This is the largest animal that has ever lived on planet Earth. This is the blue whale. And we relentlessly hunted the blue whale throughout the 20th century. We didn't hunt it so much in the 19th century because it tends to sink after it's dead. We solved that problem with these giant ships that worked like carving boards, and we were amazingly effective at hunting this animal. If this is a picture of how many blue whales there were in the world's southern oceans in the year 1900, this is how many were left by 1973. We took it down to about 500 individual animals in the southern oceans. And we hunted these animals. We went after them to make margarine and lubricants. This is just a crime. I can't imagine a moral universe in which this is an okay thing for us to do, but we did it. So we had these problems, and they were real, and they were getting worse, and they were already causing serious depletions of our planet. And there was one solution that appeared to be not just an answer, but the answer. And if the problem was that that green line kept going up and we kept wanting more, then making that line go down, turning our back on growth, on more, on this capitalist system that we invented, this really did appear to be the only solution. This school of thought was nicely summarized in 1975 by somebody who said, look, flatlining, just having stagnation, is not enough. We have to actively engage in a philosophy of degrowth because that is the only sustainable growth. This is one piece of graffiti that I found on the internet. As I was walking here to the Congress Hall earlier today, here's another piece of graffiti I came across. If you can't read the green, it says, "Smash capitalism, save the planet." Pretty recent update to this school of thought. I want to make one thing incredibly clear. I want to establish one set of facts right away. We did not do this. If you look at the record of economic growth over the past half a century, you do not see degrowth. You see more of the same. You see more good old-fashioned growth in the population around the world. The global population is almost 75% bigger than it was in 1980. And our economic growth worldwide was even faster than our population growth. The world's economy is more than 2.5 times as big as it was just 40 years ago. So you really can't see degrowth showing up in the evidence. But what has happened? And in particular, how are we doing on these 3 huge problems that we were correctly concerned about 50 years ago? Let's take a look. We actually have pretty good evidence on this. So remember, our first problem was we were going to run out of the abundance of the resources, of the materials of the earth. And if you're going to run out of something, the first thing that happens is it gets more expensive. Affordability is absolutely the opposite of scarcity. So when we look at the price system, it's a great early warning system for scarcity, for depletion, for running out of the resources of the earth. So what I want to do is look at what's been happening to prices for things over the past 80 years. So let's put that growth in the background. We see the growth in population and the growth in the economy there in gray. Now let's look at what's been happening to prices. And a couple scholars did a really interesting exercise where they asked themselves 2 fantastic questions. The first one was, let's go back to 1980. That's where the evidence starts to become very high quality. Let's go back to 1980, and let's look not at a worker in the rich world, in America or in Germany. Let's find the average worker in the world, that worker right there at the 50th percent, highest income to lowest income throughout the world. There's somebody in the middle. Let's find that world average worker. And then let's look at what earnings they had, what their wage was for 1 hour, for 60 minutes here. And we're going to say, for example, how many oranges could that person buy with 60 minutes of their labor? How much wood, how much plywood could they buy with 60 minutes of their labor? How much copper, how much different kinds of metals could you buy with an hour? And then finally, how much fossil fuel, how much coal, how much gas, how much oil out there? So the first question was to benchmark and say, how much could that person buy of all these different resources? And they tracked 50 of them, all these different resources with 1 hour of their time in 1980. And then they asked a second interesting question, which was, how many minutes of work would it take them to buy exactly that same quantity in 1981, 1982, 1983. Let's go forward in time and watch what happens to the earning power of the world's average worker, their earning ability for all these different resources. Now, obviously, if their earning potential is going up, in other words, if these resources are becoming more affordable, the line is going to go down. If the resources are becoming less affordable, the line is going to go up. So let's look at what happened with oranges and all the other foodstuffs. That's what's been happening to the world's average worker's ability. That bag of oranges now can be bought with about less than 20 minutes worth of labor. If we look at natural products like wood, wool, and cotton, pretty consistent pattern there. Minerals and metals get a little bit spikier, and you can very clearly see China coming into the world economy after the turn of the century. And then fossil fuels are the spikiest of all for all kinds of economic and geopolitical reasons. So that one kind of looks like that. But again, the downward trend is pretty clear. If you take the straight average of all 50 of these resources, all these things that we take from the earth, and look at what happened to the world average worker's ability to buy them, this is what the average looks like. The total cost has declined by just about 2/3. The average worker can buy that bundle with 20 minutes worth of labor these days. This is a remarkable, 4 decades sustained increase in affordability. It's the opposite of scarcity. So when we look at the early warning system that we have about scarcity versus abundance, it's telling us one thing very, very clearly. Resource depletion is not a thing that the economic system, that the price system is signaling, not a thing that we actually need to worry about. It's incredibly counterintuitive. I still find it weird, but the evidence is very clear on this. While that's been going on, something, to my mind, something even weirder has been happening, which is not about the supply of these resources and not about their prices, but instead about demand. How much of these resources do we need to grow our economies? And like we saw in the years leading up to Earth Day, there was one answer to that question. We need more. We need more every year. We need more and more and more, right in keeping with our economic growth. Let's look at what's been happening since 1980. So we're going to look at the total resource consumption for a big economy, namely the United States. And the United States is important. It's about 25% of the world economy, and we have very good data for a bunch of reasons, going back a long way. Let's look at what's been happening, and I want to start off by looking at the agricultural industry in the United States. And this is what's been happening over a few decades to the total agricultural output of the United States by weight. This is how much all American crops weigh over time. This is not surprising. Expressed in dollar terms, it would be going up even more quickly. But we are an agricultural powerhouse. We make more every year. Output goes up, up, up. Okay, that's not too surprising. Let's look at what's been happening to all of the inputs to agriculture, all the resources you need to grow a crop. This is what's been happening to fertilizer use, not per person, not per acre. Total fertilizer use in the US was going up with the output, yep, and then it's gone flat for the past several years. This is how much total water we use in America for agriculture. It's trending downward recently. And this is what's been happening to the total amount of cropland in the United States over this period of time. Steady decrease in the number of acres we need. And that decrease is kind of shallow, so you think, hey, big deal. Since the early 80s, back home, we have given an amount of land back to nature equal in size to the state of Washington. Now, for those of us who haven't visited the United States, some of you are probably thinking of Washington, D.C., which is a city. That's no big deal. I'm talking about this state up here. This is Washington State. It's a decent-sized piece of real estate in America. We have given that back to nature. We are no longer farming on it. That land is now returning to the wild. So I look at this and I think that's pretty fascinating. Does it blow up? Does it apply to the economy as a whole? It does in some pretty fundamental ways. Let's keep drawing that economic graph. Here's 115 years of American economic growth. Here's how much paper we needed to go along with that economic growth. You start to see the smartphone era very clearly here. Our total use of paper is declining. Same thing goes for other wood products. We are decoupling, growing our economy from using these kinds of resources. I want to talk about metal now and total metal use in America. And I want to say one thing in advance, because whenever I talk about metal use, people say, if it's declining, that's just because manufacturing is declining in America. You've outsourced everything to China, so of course, consumption might be going down. No. We have not outsourced all of our manufacturing to China. We're still a large manufacturing country. Our manufacturing output, the size of our manufacturing industry grows every non-recession year. So this is what's been happening to output. This is what's been happening to our total use of the big 5 metals in America over that time. You see the same pattern. Used to be going up perfectly with the economy, and now there's a very strong decoupling. One other really crucial thing to notice about this graph is that the color of the line for each metal corresponds to the color of the metal. I just want credit for that. Thank you. Thank you for that. We started off by talking about energy. So let's look at total energy use in America over this period of time. Here's our same graph. 117 years. This is actually 217 years of American economic growth. This was what was happening to energy use up until 1970. Perfect relationship. This is what's been happening to total energy use since 1970. An almost complete divorce between the two. Total energy use back home has been essentially flat for a decade. That's really good news, especially because this is what's happening to our total CO2 emissions in America. And this line actually is calculated in a pretty interesting way. That red line includes all of the carbon embedded in all the products that we import. So it's consumption-based, not production-based. It's a correct accounting of the total carbon footprint of the American economy. Now, I want to be clear. This line is not going down quickly enough. We need to take action on this, but it absolutely is going down. We've decoupled energy use from growing our economy over time. I hope this brings up a pretty fundamental question for people, which is, how did we accomplish this? We clearly did not engage in degrowth as a nation, so how are we now using fewer resources? It's a large part of what my book is about, and I'd love to talk to people afterward. I want to give you one very quick example of what's going on that helps me understand what's going on throughout the economy as a whole. And we have to go to kind of an unusual source. I want to show you a newspaper ad from 1991 in America for an electronics retailer. So this is an ad from the Buffalo News, from a newspaper in Buffalo, New York in 1991, from Radio Shack, from an electronics retailer. And what I find fascinating about this ad, there are 15 physical devices on this ad. 13 of them have vanished into your smartphone. Would you raise your hand, please, if you still have a tape recorder at home, an answering machine, a VCR, a CD player, if you live in a log cabin with no access to the same people. For the rest of us, many devices have just collapsed down into an extremely materials-light resource called the smartphone. This is what's been happening all over the economy. Big ways, small ways, obvious ways, subtle ways. Our economy is progressively dematerializing. It's a pretty clear phenomenon in the rich world. It's spreading pretty quickly throughout the world. For example, Nigeria is never going to spend money on a copper telephone network. That is a thing they're not going to do. So that's what's been happening to resource use. It's a very, very different pattern than we were expecting half a century ago on Earth Day. What about the problem that we're polluting the world? We were absolutely polluting the world. Let's go back and look at Cleveland. What we did to deal with this is not the magic of capitalism. We dealt with the magic of smart regulation. In the rich world, we put restrictions in place. We said, look, you can't pollute, or even more interestingly, you can go ahead and pollute, but you have to pay, and you can buy and sell the right to pollute as long as total pollution goes down. We put in place some really interesting measures, and what is the result? That same river in Cleveland is now a pretty good place to fish for trout. So it's a good place for fishermen to hang out. This is where we left off atmospheric pollution in the United States. It was pretty steadily going up until 1970. This is what's been happening in the years since. Total pollution in the rich world is down. Atmospheric pollution is about less than 1/10 in many ways of what it was half a century ago. This is a huge victory for the environmental movement, for very smart regulation. And it helps me understand the right playbook for our toughest problem in the natural world. We got to fix global warming. That becomes much more conceptually clear to me. The right way to do that becomes clear to me as soon as I realize that greenhouse gases are another form of atmospheric pollution. And I don't say that to minimize the problem or trivialize it. I say that to categorize the problem, because now we know the playbook. It has worked. If any of us here have at least 2 friends who are economists, you know that economists never agree on anything. And they will argue as much time as you'll give them. They'll argue about anything. Here's the one exception. I have never seen this much unanimity from the economics profession as about the right playbook for fighting global warming. Put a tax on carbon, put a price on it, make it a high enough price to change behavior, rebate that money immediately to the households in the country. It's called a carbon dividend. 3,500 prominent economists have never agreed on anything before in history. Here they are signing the letter about the most effective thing that we can be doing. And the frustration is that we're not doing this almost anywhere in the world in a way that has teeth. This is a policy no-brainer. I'm not saying it's going to be easy. Conceptually, it's the clearest thing that we should be doing. And then finally, where are we with wiping out the species? How are we doing on this critical front? This is what we did with pollution. We added another set of extraordinarily important regulation and restriction on this. In most of the world, we made it completely illegal to hunt some animals. You just can't hunt blue whales anymore. We put restrictions on what time of year you could hunt. We protected marine terrain and parks on land. We put parts of the Earth's surface out of bounds for hunting and for capitalism as a whole. And the results of this has been pretty fantastic. This is where we left off our whales. There were about 500 of them in the world's southern oceans just within my lifetime. Here's our latest census of them. They are not back all the way. They are coming back. And a great phrase that I learned from Stuart Brand, who's one of the heroes of the environmental movement, he taught me that nature bats last. It's an American baseball analogy. You want to bat last when you're playing baseball. And his point was, if we humans get out of the way, if we'll just leave, give the land back to nature, don't allow hunting, put restrictions on, just get out of the way, nature will come back. Nature is resilient. It's not as good as not screwing up in the first place. We should not have screwed that up. But it's not too late. And if we can get out of the way, we see these kinds of rebounds. And we see this happening with the black bear, with the beaver, with bison in America and Europe, with wolves. We see this coming back. Nature is resilient. Give it a chance. Watch the good things that will happen. So I want to go back to the questions that we started with. I've been talking about 4 forces that come together. Market forces, the desire of companies to save money, technologies that let them do that, let them dematerialize consumption, a public that demands action, and governments that listen to their people. In the book, I call these the 4 horsemen, not of the apocalypse, but actually of the optimist. Because the evidence shows me that when these 4 work together, all kinds of pretty powerful things can happen. So I want to go back to the question that we started with. What have we learned over the past half a century about our ability to solve big problems? And to be a little bit more specific, do we know, what have we learned? Can we solve our big problems while continuing to grow, while continuing to increase human prosperity? The past half century tells me we can absolutely do this. I'm not saying it's going to be easy or painless. We know the playbook for improving both human prosperity and the state of nature. I want to end with one final photograph. And it's the most encouraging thing that I've seen in forever. I assure you this is not photographed. I said the whales are coming back. The whales are now coming back. You can spot whales off the coast of New York City. I think that's a pretty good note to end the day on. Thank you very much. I propose that instead of questions, why don't we just go out and have a drink? I'm happy to go out there. The books are out there. They're available. I'd love to talk to you about it. Thank you all for sticking around all day. I appreciate it.